The title of this film, Missing Voices, Our Doors Are Open to All, an exploration of ways that deaf and disabled people's organizations could include disabled Roma. Next slide. This study was funded by the National Lottery as part of the Disability Research into Independent Living and Learning drill program for disabled people. The study was carried out in partnership by the University of Worcester and Shaping Our Lives. The next slide says, this film features the views of Becky Meakin and Teresia Rostas. The next slide says, Becky is the General Manager of Shaping Our Lives National Network Service Users and Disabled People. The next slide says, Teresia Rostas of Care for Young People's Future is a Roma community connector in the Sheffield area. The next slide we meet Becky Meakin, who is seated in a black dress with golden swans.
Disabled people's organisations offer a different approach because they base the work they do on the experiences of the people who work in them, and so it's really about providing knowledge and information in the way that you would expect from a peer or from somebody who has experienced something very similar to you and can share their own ways and means of best dealing with that. So Shaping Our Lives has partnered with the University of Worcester for some research about disabled people in Roma communities, and the research was funded in order that disabled people could take part as researchers equally with people from higher education institutes such as universities. The research is about two things really. It's about whether disabled people within Roma communities have a voice and are accessing services to help them in their day-to-day lives. And it's also looking at and talking to deaf and disabled people's organisations and asking them, are you working with people from Roma communities? Do you know if people from Roma communities are able to access your services? The type of work that we're doing with the University of Worcester is called co-production, where everyone takes part equally and there are no power imbalances between the different types of people. I'm a disabled person myself, so I have an insight into being disabled, and I'm able to share that with the other researchers and also with the steering group who help guide the project. What I'm really leading on in terms of this project is talking to disabled people within the Roma community and trying to explore if they are getting the help and advice that would enable them to take part equally in the community and also within the wider community of society in general. This is important to Shaping Our Lives. We work to ensure that people can live as independently as possible and be equal citizens. And to enable people to do that often means if they're a disabled person that they can take part if the barriers to going out, getting to the doctor's surgery, taking part in social activities, taking part in leisure activities are removed so that they can take part in the same way that somebody who doesn't have an impairment or health condition can take part. I've also been talking to deaf and disabled people's organisations, and they work specifically to provide services that help to take away these barriers for people to take part and have a full and active and independent life. And what we found so far is that none of the organisations are excluding disabled people from any community, and that includes the Roma community, from using their services. But perhaps what they haven't thought about is what additional barriers there might be for a disabled person from a diverse community. And those barriers may be around literacy, or they may be cultural barriers, or they may be the fear of attitudes and prejudices against them as a community. And I suppose, ironically, disabled people experience a lot of discrimination and oppression and poor attitudes themselves, but are not necessarily aware of the discrimination that somebody from another minority community might experience, such as Roma people. When I've spoken with people in communities, disabled people in communities, I'm very aware that there is a very strong cultural tendency to care and look after other people from those communities, which is a wonderful thing, because I don't feel that as a white English person that's necessarily strong in our community. However, I have tried to share my own experiences with disabled people in Roma communities. For example, I'm lucky enough to work, but I do still take time to go and meet with some other blind people where I live, because as a group they've organised a swimming session where it's just blind people. You can imagine it's quite amusing really, because none of us can see what we're doing, but it does mean we can go in the pool without any fear of getting in the way of anyone else. We can get some exercise, we have a bit of a laugh, we're allowed to use the sauna afterwards, so it's a really nice time. But most importantly, what I get from it is just chatting with people, is hearing about things that they've recently done and how they did it, or something they've discovered that's a new piece of equipment, or even something much more simple, which might be, how to safely make a cup of coffee without pouring boiling water over yourself. So I think probably most of my life skills that I've developed as a blind person, I've actually learned from other blind people. And I think it's important that if people want to, there is an opportunity for them to meet other people with the same impairment and health condition through their local deaf or disabled people's organisation, and start to share some of these and learn some of these useful tips that help us actually just get on in our day-to-day lives.
Next, we will meet Theresia Rostas from the Care for Young People's Future.
My experience with disabled Roma so far, because as I said, I have worked for the local authority for nearly 10 years, I have been able to see probably thousands of families with undiagnosed needs, or with disabilities, or with additional needs that required support. Apart from the education bit, which I used to do, I was able to complete different forms for them and refer them to services such as psychologists, hearing impairment, speech and language, and so on. So this is a massive concern to me in terms of seeing Roma people with undiagnosed needs. It's causing a huge pressure on the community because of the fact that they don't know the system in the UK, and it takes between 6 and 18 months to get a special educational needs statement when we talk about education. If you think about different, even more complex needs, which it wasn't in my role, like adult services and disabilities, that might take even more. So my advice for the Roma community would be to, obviously, as soon as they get into a city in England, to register to the doctor, register to a GP. If they've got any documents from their doctor from abroad, bring them over, present them to the doctor, they might translate them. Ask for an interpreter whether it's Roma or Slovakian, just ask for the interpreter and make sure from this first meeting you are clear about what your health needs are and your health issues are and your expectations.
The next slide says, we will now present some slides with conclusions and recommendations from the research project. The next slide says, the project will make recommendations to deaf and disabled people's organizations and community connector organizations about how best to include, advocate for disabled members of their Roma populations, including making information available in accessible formats. The next slide says, there was a low level of interest shown in the Missing Voices project by deaf and disabled people's organizations, many of whom are struggling to survive in times of austerity. The next slide says, there were mixed views across the Roma communities about where they would use mainstream deaf and disabled people's organizations as a way of having their missing voices heard. Two groups said they would, whereas another group said they would only want their own organizations run by and for their own people. Local customized solutions seem the way forward. The next slide says, deaf and disabled people's organizations do not reach out proactively to disabled Roma people in their communities. None reported actually having Roma members, but most say, our doors are open to all, which does not facilitate inclusion. The next slide says, many Roma families in the UK seem to care for their own disabled members partly through culture, but also because they do not know about local services or organizations, plus a fear of discrimination. The next slide says, cultural legacies of shame and stigma regarding disabled community members remained, with some evidence that such views were changing via exposure to the UK context. The next slide says, the roles of community connectors, liaison-type staff employed by charities or government agencies who were sometimes from Roma communities, were seen by community members and the research team as critical links. In the main, however, the knowledge held by community connectors about disability issues was patchy, and there was no specific guidance on disabled organizations or services available for Roma. The next slide says, there were many comments about a lack of suitable interpreters and the difficulty in understanding concepts and terms relating to disability. The next slide says, many Roma families have come to the UK to find better employment conditions, but housing stock is primarily in the private sector and of poor quality. There were views expressed that landlords would not allow adaptations to accommodate disability. The next slide says, the project represented the first opportunity to hear the hitherto missing voices of disabled members of Roma communities, and participants in the focus groups were appreciative of the debate having been brought to the open. The next slide says, music credit, Cousin Kenny Kennard. There are 5 logos. The logos on the left include the Community Fund, the Shaping Our Lives University of Worcester, and the logos on the right, starting from the top, we see the Center of Alternative Education and the Reintegration for Roma logo, and the Drill logo at the bottom right-hand side. The final slide says, a film by Real Master Production and Rosa Census